Faith in Mind, Shin Jinmei, by Sosan Kanchi Zenji. The perfect way is not difficult. Just avoid getting caught up in preferences. When you are free from aversion and craving, it reveals itself fully and without disguise. 1/10 of an inch's difference, and heaven and earth are set apart. If you wish to see it before your own eyes, have no fixed thoughts, either for or against it. Good afternoon. Here we are on day 2 of our anniversary session, our 48th anniversary here of Bosatsu Zendo Kongoji. In fact, we've had the privilege of chanting the Diamond Sutra, which we began this morning. So this Kongo, if you'll notice in the intonation, there's Kongo. So this is diamond. So we're Diamond Temple. And it really is a wonderful opportunity to be here together for this practice and for the Dharma. Yes, without this Dharma, we would not be here. And without those who help bring forth and carry this light of the Dharma, we certainly wouldn't have the chance to come together now. I almost feel the need to offer a little caution in regards to my talk. I feel if you can picture a dog, it's left it at home, you come home and it's gotten into the trash, it's torn apart some pillows, it just went buck wild in the house and just strew everything everywhere. And this is what you come home to. And well, of course you acknowledge the dog might be sitting there lying down, just it knows it did something terrible, but and all you can do is acknowledge and just start to clean up. And of course from there, you have to look and listen. So this is really how I feel internally in many regards. Certainly as I arrived, and I've been doing my best to tidy up before welcoming you all over. So previously I've spoken here in regards to perception. I think it might have been a year ago from now. And I found over the course of this last year there's been some continual unfolding of what that really, how our perception is shaped. Certainly something I've talked about, but I found that I've really been delving into this aversion and craving. There's so many of our habituated behaviors, thoughts, activities that really stem in part from aversion and craving. Of course, aversion and craving themselves are these pursuits brought forth by this sense of a separate identity. And feeling that we're separate, there's an insecurity. And in that insecurity, we try to find feebly, misguidedly, ways in which we can find a security, a sense of groundedness in things that are otherwise ever-flowing, unpermanent, and fleeting. It can feel a little daunting, overwhelming, frustrating. It can feel rather horrible at times when we engage in these behaviors. Here Sosan Kanchi Zenji, our third ancestor, points to this aversion and craving and the fact that you're caught up in these preferences. And in reflecting on this, I was reminded at some point at Hoenji in Syracuse, where Shinge Roshi is abbot, where I began my practice with her some years ago. There was a guest speaker. He was a Tibetan Lama, but originally from Ireland. And he was quite the character. It was somewhat disorienting in a sense. He just had a very boisterous personality. He would say something and then he would laugh and be leaning back. And it was interesting though. I found that in the process of wondering what the hell, like, who is this man? That there was something disarming in this, because there was something also very sincere and present about it. He was himself, as odd as it might have seemed, as what you might think somebody should be in this position. He's a Lama. He should appear a certain way, behave a certain way. And he just didn't have that. And he had talked about preferences and acknowledging the fact, well, of course we have preferences. They're unavoidable. They're going to arise. There's going to be things that, if nothing else, through our senses, are either pleasing or displeasing. And of course, there's a myriad way in which we divide and assess things from there, but it's very ordinary. It's part of the human condition. However, to expect and pursue those preferences is where, in part, our suffering and difficulties and conflicts tend to arise. It really is this catalyst into darkness. And it's, looking back, it's a odd thing of when we look at this insecurity, we're confused, we're in this darkness, and then we tend to engage in things that perpetuate it. And tend to look in all the wrong places, hoping that all these impermanent, fleeting things will somehow gratify us in a way that can sustain us. And they can, of course, in many ways help encourage, support us, provide things that we genuinely do appreciate. But there's that sense of wanting, to want more, to crave more, instead of simply appreciating it as it is. And I think in many ways, Sosan Kanchi Zenji sums it up very nicely in the lines that follow this introductory portion. To set up what you like against what you dislike, this is the disease of the mind. So in looking at things that I might say today, I found myself drawn to the book by Pema Chodron, Comfortable with Uncertainty. It's one I've actually had in my library for some years, and somehow I hadn't really picked up before this. I was apparently waiting until that moment of what was particularly pertinent. And in this book, in a chapter called The Root of Suffering, I guess I would call it a chapter, but they're really more of just little short reflections in many ways, things that you can pick up, and they'll provide useful guidance in a very succinct and direct manner. And one of them is called The Root of Suffering. And she says in there, what keeps us unhappy and stuck in a limited view of reality is our tendency to seek pleasure and avoid pain, to seek security and avoid groundlessness, to seek comfort and avoid discomfort. Now, I'm sure before you arrived today, you're familiar with all these things, but there's nothing like being on the cushion to really put them right in your face. And, there's that pleasure and pain. Perhaps in your midst of pain, you're thinking of other things that might be much, much, much more desirable than sitting here in agony, wondering what's going on. Even in day one, and sometimes particularly in day one, there can be a lot of sort of anxiety, a tension, like this underlying energy that is basically things that you've been leaving unattended. And they have a way of presenting themselves when all of a sudden you just sit down. And it's interesting because the act of sitting down in a very experiential way, you just feel very grounded. There's that way in which you just can't avoid things. You're just right there, just right with it. And yet, experientially, there is that discomfort with really the groundless, this uncertainty, this ever-evolving manifestation of impermanence. And as I was saying earlier, there's different myriad ways in which we engage in this aversion and craving. And one of the teachings is of the 8 worldly dharmas. And so they come in pairs. And in a section, Hope and Fear, Pema Chodron outlines what they are. The first pair is pleasure and pain. Second is praise and criticism, or blame. Fame and disgrace, and gain and loss. So of course we want pleasure and pain, but then there's the fact of we live with other beings, and we'd like to have them tell us how wonderful we are. Compliments, of course, those always feel nice. Something to acknowledge is important, and sometimes just simply to acknowledge, like, oh, like you did a wonderful job. But internally, when we're seeking those things, we're longing for them, hoping for them, it just perpetuates that insecurity. And then, of course, complementing that, or it doesn't feel so complimentary anyway, is the criticism and blame. So, of course, we don't want to be criticized or blamed, basically told if things are wrong because of what we did or said, or the ways in which our contributions, if nothing else, weren't appreciated. And this, too, is an unfortunate thing in that, of course, none of us are perfect. Of course, yes, the perfect way, we are perfect, and yet we live this life, and not all of our conduct is perfect. And that is okay. It's the challenge being of really embracing that, opening up to it. And the challenge in our karmic conditioning, even the things that precede this life, the things that come with us, all that baggage that comes around, we have travel from one life to the next, and we have things we bring along. You might picture one of those big old trunks they used to have that for the on the ships and stuff for going around the world. I suspect Bodhidharma didn't have one of those, but he experienced going onto the ship and all the things that you find yourself in the midst of. But we arrive in this life and we meet these conditions and all the people of which that they present various ways of interpreting or experiencing them, and all of our tendencies from our conditioning and how we relate to that. And sometimes, even though it's offered in a warm and loving way, we don't necessarily feel that within ourselves. Even at a young age, you can feel a sense of a criticism when all that somebody's simply doing is acknowledging of, like, you live in this life, there's other people, other beings, and there's ways of being attentive to what's happening within yourself that can help you meet those around you. And of course, you're young. You don't know how to, you can't process that, all that rationality. It's really not your natural state when you emerge in this world. There's a much more immediate, direct way in which we engage. And the interesting thing as we age, and particularly within this practice, there's a reality in which we're really having to reconnect with that. It's very primordial. It's a reality of the immediacy of the moment in which I think children are particularly attuned to. And yet, in those conditions, there's, that uncertainty, not being sure, not knowing where they stand. As Sesshin said before, there's this groundless world we live in, so what do I do? Where do I go? So along with the criticism, as I was noting, the blame, and we of course can feel blamed, of course we can be flat out blamed, and then in our own activity may also tend to blame others for why we're experiencing various things. And in thinking of, particularly in the world of our as children, there's those important adults in our life, our parents. And if nothing else, when you get older, they're particularly the ones you want to blame. But even even in your childhood, you have ways in which, just emotionally, you don't have the wherewithal and understanding to be able to do anything except sort of lash back at them. In whatever way, it might be fairly mundane, just kind of, ignoring them or being just kind of argumentative, or all the old talk back or little things that you can do that establish the fact that you are yourself, you have your own position, and it's not their place to tell you what to do. And it's been interesting, I guess, just thinking of my time back. I grew up in Wisconsin, and since having left residence here in 2021, towards the latter part of the summer, I have been there, and one of my friends has his oldest is now 7, and his youngest will be coming up on 4. And it's been very interesting just to see them age and develop and their personalities emerge, and just the little ways in which, it doesn't have to be that long. It's in a sense, obviously it's still that person, and yet at the same time they're a different person. And it's very interesting at this time, as I said, the oldest is 7. So you can see there's a real dramatic shift in just the way they perceive and relate to things, and particularly the sense of what they're attuned to. They have a little bit more of an openness and awareness of what we might otherwise call the adult life, these adult experiences. They're more of a conscious awareness of these things that either can make them feel more comfortable or more at ill at ease. And of course, that too is shaped by their own conditioning, but also shaped by those around them. I guess one of the things I thought was particularly interesting, the oldest, 2 and 3 years old, he seemed to have this obsession with people having been injured. So I'd see him and he'd say, I had a cut, or this person had a cut, this person hurt themselves in this way. And I thought, okay. And it was very odd. I didn't know what to make of it. You acknowledge it and kind of, then just engage with them. And I found it very interesting because at a later point, it just kind of dawned on me. My friend's mother has kind of this tendency to be concerned. So she doesn't want her, either her children, of course, raising them, or her grandchildren to be injured, hurt in any way. She loves and cares for them. But in that sense of concern can be that sense of fear that is felt. And he was particularly attuned to that. And it's just very interesting to see these ways in which is otherwise seemingly, it's somewhat benign. It's, it's nothing particularly overt. She's not aggressive in it by any manner. Like she's a very gentle, loving person. And yet that fear, that energy is what's really experienced. That thing of, particularly in that sense of insecurity of like, what, if anything, does this have to say about me? And so we incorporate those various ways in which the examples that are provided for us and how we relate to and conduct ourselves in our own lives. So coming back to these 8 worldly dharmas, the next pair is fame and disgrace. There's that saying of like, your reputation precedes you. Your reputation precedes you. And this can be stated, and tone is always a big part of language, in different ways of relating to it. Either there can be that sense of, like, so you're the person, like that sense of acknowledging, like, I've heard good things about you, or perhaps not. You're that disgraceful person. And these aren't things that we necessarily want to be known for. Of course, the good things, by all means, but do we really want to be having these elements of a disgrace carried forth for us? That's one of the curious things we can do for other people. We carry forth these things that they feel guilt about or shame about, sometimes even things that they've been able themselves to be able to work through. And yet we still hold on to them on their behalf. If nothing else, you pull out that card, remember when? Yeah. And then there's just simply the reality. As I was saying, the ways in which we can be conscious of those things for ourselves, to have that sense of guilt or shame. And of course, internally, there's all these dynamics at play. And then the last pair is gain and loss. And this probably sounds somewhat familiar, perhaps for some of you. I guess now would be yesterday morning when we recited Faith in Mind. There's the lines, gain and loss, right and wrong. Away with them once and for all. I don't know, I just particularly, I personally have a very deep connection to this Faith in Mind. I think it's one of the more succinct and profound teachings that you'll encounter in the Zen Buddhist texts. For me, it's quite akin and complementary to the Diamond Sutra. It was one of the things of when I was here as a resident, we would, with whatever frequency, chant or recite Faith in Mind, and we were having our Dharma study in which we were delving into the Diamond Sutra. And at least at that time, till really later on, unbeknownst to me, they'd been really working in tandem. And yeah, there's just that mutuality. This can't be separated. And at the same time, there is a certain distinction. If nothing else, they're a expression through a particular mouth. But they're really directing our attention to the same matter. So, as I've kind of been suggesting throughout this, is that when we really look at all these, this fame and disgrace, gain and loss, right and wrong, all that kind of stuff, that if you really investigate them, they too fall under the, they're impermanent. There's nothing fixed about them. There's nothing inherent within them There's simply the fact of our experience is going to tend to be shaped with them, by them, either in a sense of a positive or negative framework, depending upon the conditions in which we find ourselves. And one of the ways in which it can be very interesting and kind of we turn it on its head, there perhaps are those that are more familiar here with this self-blame, this self-condemning, what other types of unwholesome activities, thought formations, any things that we can have to say about ourselves that aren't particularly flattering. And so you can take all these things in the sense of whether or not you're even worthy. Of course, we can inflict this on others as well, but we can do this internally. And so there's that sense of pleasure and pain. And of course, inherently, yeah, we're going to long for pleasure. And at the same time, we don't necessarily feel we're worthy of it. And it's a curious thing because there has to be something that we are getting from that. If nothing else, the certainty of our point of view, we can perpetuate that in affirming the fact of how we feel or how we view ourselves. So in some sense, yes, it's a form of pain, and yet there must be a sense of pleasure in it because if nothing else, we're affirmed. And it's kind of these twisted ways in which unconsciously we can really use even what otherwise we might perceive as positive elements as some form of weaponry. So continuing from comfortable with uncertainty, there's a section of the facts of life, suffering. So this in many ways is kind of a little synopsis of what I've been saying. And so Pema Chodron puts it, to put it concisely, we suffer when we resist the noble and irrefutable truth of impermanence and death. And she notes, we have these underlying feelings that change should be graspable and predictable, that sense of security, at least if nothing else, whether or not we like it or not, we might at least know what to anticipate. And of course, there's that way in which through partly our collective ways in which we tend to repeat certain behaviors, say certain things, we can, in some sense, count on certain aspects of that. And yet, and the reality of it is just simply change. And if you look at that truth, that everything's impermanent, that things can't be grasped, they can't be held onto, and even though there might be patterns, we can't say with any true certainty that they're predictable. I mean, we'd like to think even for ourselves, perhaps you've surprised yourself in life. Things that come forth that seem otherwise not in accordance with your normal behaviors. Things that can be, sometimes unfortunately, cause deep unrest. There's those ways in which if we find ourselves in particular circumstances and put particular strains, we might do things that we can't fathom we would ever do. At the same time, if we really can embrace these elements of things that we might not feel are beneficial, there is a more of a space and openness towards having those potentially beneficial things emerge. We're not putting so much confinement around who we can be or what's possible in our own lives, what's possible for others' lives. We certainly can restrain and restrict other people and to tell them who they're supposed to be as well. And oftentimes these can be based upon just our initial impressions. Of course, if you have enough time with people, you can start to find, perhaps your impression wasn't really in alignment with who this person is. Of course, no matter what you do, say or do, there's that reality in which it's just a little glimpse of who we might define as this particular individual. As can't really pin them down, you can't define them. At the same time, there's a certain quality to each one of us, a certain kind of personality that can change with time. And I guess in thinking of a way to kind of present it, like in our practice, we're giving these Dharma names. There's a certain quality that our teacher sees in us it's partly to aspire to, but also something that's there within us. And it has a certain way in which it's expressed through each of our individual personalities, in each of our own lives. And the wonderful thing being here in a Sangha is the way that we can help support each other in that process, at the same time inspire and influence each other in our own self-discovery. So the second point that Pema Chodron brings up, essentially I've addressed, but we proceed as if we are separate from everything else, as if we are a fixed identity. And as I was just saying, there's even in who we are, from a younger age to when we get older, we can't really say that we're the same person. Yes, we're living this life. It has a particular relationship. We have still the same parents as when we were born. And of course, at some point, both our parents and ourselves will pass. And then she notes as well, we look for happiness in all the wrong places. So really I started talking about this at the beginning, but I think it's an important one to reiterate. I can say I certainly have a tendency to engage in those things that they might be pleasurable, they're enjoyable. For me, in some ways, my real addiction in life is music. I love music. In some sense, I just can't get enough of it. Like, it's an interesting thing. There's a way in which my egoic relationship can help justify it, but there's a certain way in which it's also really supported me in my practice. Of course, those that love poetry, in many ways, songs can also be just a musical presentation of poetry. But then there's just the sound itself. It tends to invoke certain feelings, different things that can arise within us. And at least for myself over time, one of the things I've really found is pursuing things that I wouldn't necessarily even have thought of as music before. I mean, in my younger years, I wouldn't have ever thought of, mind you, it's these titles, these genres that we affix to things that, of course, the artists are like, ugh, stop trying to define my music. But, ambient music. I'm sure perhaps some of you have listened to some ambient music and you're like, wow, you might find it a bit boring, or there's no clear defined structure to some of it. But I sort of found over time that one of the things I personally really appreciate about it is what I've defined as essentially soundscapes. I mean, if we really just think of being in this room, there's the room, but there's the breeze, the birds. And that's where even another one of the things I found I've enjoyed at times are defined as field recordings. Somebody goes out and they record various things and they incorporate that into what you might not want to define of as music, but in some ways it doesn't matter how you define it. It's simply something to really meet with and engage with in your own experience. To have somebody who's been looking at things open up your perspective to a different way of living and experiencing this life. So, in some ways, I too truly find real happiness in this. It opens up a sense of possibility. and a receptivity too. I think it's just one of the things, there's really that companion of an openness and a receptivity. So it's not just simply, but to be willing to receive it and to truly hear it. And yet, for at least for myself, there's that way in which, I can't help but want to find, okay, what else is out there? There's a way in which you feel inspired, you find these things you enjoy, and you can't help but find a certain curiosity even to satisfy your own sense of pleasure. And so at least for myself, that's one of the things I have to, keep myself in check in regards to. But I found myself in thinking of that pleasure and pain, that, also one of the beauties is that, in those poetic elements in particular, or sometimes just simply in a particular chord, a note, an instrument, there's just something that you can feel in your whole body. And it perhaps is painful, but there's just something so immediate and in some ways very freeing about it. I mean, despite our seemingly solid appearance, we're very fluid and resonant. And that's one of the things I love with sound, is these very cells resonate with sound. That's partly why I really like my music loud. You can truly feel that music. It's just in your body. And just a tangential thought to that, not too long ago, I saw a film, it's a documentary called String Theory. It's called The Richard Davis Method. So some of you perhaps know Richard Davis is a jazz bassist, a rather renowned one, who in many ways really left the profession to teach music at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And it's a really remarkable documentary. It's definitely very inspiring, talking about these ways in which we can really inspire one another. I mean, he's just so passionate, not just about the music, but about people. Just to be able to come together. And one of the things he's really done is not just teach the college students, but to teach children. And they've found ways in which they weren't constrained to the same modes of education that were often found in piano and violin. Piano and violin are considered two of the premier instruments, and certainly for young prodigies and others, they tend to be thrust at very young ages into playing these instruments that really aren't sized to them. They can't reach their finger with whatever you want to find that as. Their ability to reach with their fingers is limited. And then if you think of a violin, I mean, it can be almost as tall as them. How are they supposed to play this? So of course there's been ways in which people have become a little bit humane in acknowledging that there's physical limitations for children, and they've designed instruments to accommodate to that. And that's even been for the basses. And so they'll have people who will be in that 3 to 5 year old range that will be invited to play. And it's kind of a big workshop, really. So it's, of course, all these students and Richard Davis, who unfortunately passed within the last couple of years. But also many other, sometimes prior students, and just other professionals. And it's just this wonderful communal way in which they come together. And why I really found myself thinking of this is there was somebody in there who was talking about why they play the upright, the standing bass. And I can't think of what note he spoke of. But he says, okay, now you hold the bass. The bass is literally against your body. He's like, now play this note. And they feel that note. And he says, that's why I play the upright bass. And for me, that is music in its real essence. So, kind of coming back to where my initial outline was, in many ways I've in part kind of talked about this. In part, to overturn this tendency is that we don't necessarily want to lose the very conditions that we feel overwhelmed by or simply confined by, because as Pema Chodron is pointing our attention to, we like things to be predictable, convenient, and we derive a false sense of security in the fact that we know. We don't truly know it, but we can at least fool ourselves into thinking that we do. And really in looking at this sense of this underlying suffering and this aversion and craving, over time I've kind of come to this little saying of, like, life is a package deal. And there's just certain assurances. There are things that we can be assured of. If you're born, you'll die. And anything that arises also passes. I mean, it's not just ourselves, but the 10,000 things. And really at the heart of all this is this pleasure and pain. Really, in many ways, aversion and craving is just simply looking for that sense of gratification, some sense of comfort, whatever it might be. But there is an important thing in knowing that in this life, that pleasure and pain are both part. It's impossible to separate them. I mean, can you really imagine a life in which you only had one or the other? I mean, unfortunately, due to people's perceptions, their experiences, their conditional suffering, sometimes they do feel that they're caught in those particular states. There's those that are willfully ignorant. Sometimes that can be one, so we say ignorance is bliss. And sometimes there seems to be those people that, at least on face, kind of seem to go by that. I mean, I can't deny the fact, of course, I enjoy various sense pleasures, things in life that it has to offer. And yet I can't help but at times look at some people and wonder how they can seemingly genuinely enjoy the lives they have of just going about just kind of the same thing over and over. I mean, if you think back to kind of I think in some ways a prime example is a model set forth in the 1950s, the happy hour. You've gone to work, now it's time to come together and imbibe. And there can be a way in which it's a very genuine, sincere means of joining. It can be true. And yet, there are those rare examples of people that seem to have been able to do it their whole lives. They come together with the same people and they basically get drunk, go to bed, and they had a certain tolerance. They could just simply go to bed even in their 80s and get up the next day, maybe not quite as sprightly as they had earlier in their lives, and it's kind of this element in which, and then they'll get together and do that again. And to them, it's a pleasurable life. And I don't know how. It's not to criticize or say that they're bad people. It's just to say of how can you have a way in which you don't allow yourself to really encounter pain? I mean, it's maybe not something that we want to pursue. We don't have to pursue it really. We'll encounter it. But if we really open up to our pain, it can be very enlivening. There's something profoundly immediate about it. I mean, you really can't look elsewhere sometimes. It grabs all of your attention. And if you open up to that, it can open up for you. And in this universality of this pleasure and pain, and really opening up to it, we can really be with it and be with others in pain. You know, this compassion with pain. And it's really one of the most essential parts of this practice. I mean, really, it's at the heart of it, is being with pain. It's one of the most truly loving acts we can do. So, really underlying this experience of pleasure and pain is our six sense objects. And going back to faith and mind, if you want to walk the course of the one vehicle, be not prejudiced against the six sense objects. When you are not prejudiced against the six sense objects, you are then one with enlightenment. In the mind harmonious with the way, we have the principle of identity, in which we find all strivings quieted. Doubts and irresolutions are completely done away with, and true faith is manifested. And in my recent reading of this faith in mind, this element of the six sense objects really called to me in a way that I had not really seen it before. I mean, in some ways, I haven't really looked at it. The six sense objects, okay, yes, there's the six senses, we experience the world, and it wasn't so much as a dismissive. It was just more of that way in which it was more restricted to kind of an intellectual engagement. But the six sense objects are the very means by which we experience this life. Pleasure and pain, what would those be without the ability to, in this body, experience it? I mean, this very body is our means of experience. We're not confined and limited to it. And at the same time, in this life, what would it be without this body? And so, of course, that's where some of it really comes about, in this really looking for the pleasure and pain of the ways in which these senses send certain stimuli as to what kind of experience we can derive from them. And there's an inherent importance into this. If you look at it from this, well, those that don't know, I definitely have a background in the sciences. So the elements of evolution I find particularly interesting. I mean, they're very informative, and they provide a useful way in which to relate to the world in which we live. And some of it is the importance of remembering that before we had these comforts, this building over our head, the fact that we can go to a meal 3 times a day, that there were other factors at play. You had to impart with others, namely our parents or other family. You had to find shelter. You had to get your own food. You had to provide your own clothing, and all these things that required ways in which to live in the world. Your senses would help you know what to do, what would put you at risk, what you could or could not eat. And so they have a very fundamental and important function. It's just this way in which when we're not when survival isn't the first and foremost element of living this particular life, there's a way in which, in that comfort that can arise, these other desires tend to come forth. And so that's where there's a real importance in having that intimacy with them. And yeah, to really reflect on them, not just to experience them, but to really investigate them, to see the fact that like there's a function to them, and at the same time, there's nothing particularly inherent within them. You can have two people who have a very different experience of the same thing, whether it be as the taste of something. Somebody might find it exceptional, and somebody else, ugh. You know, there's things of some people have conditioned certain ways for even bitterness. It's actually very important to have a sense towards bitterness, because things that are poisonous tend to be bitter. And you know, if you think again, coming back to like children, be particularly sensitive at sometimes to that bitterness. So there's certain vegetables in particular that they might find quite terrible, honestly. They're not just being difficult, like to them in a sense, from a evolutionary standpoint, it's almost like it's a correlative to being poisoned. So they're not just being dramatic, like it just is terrible to them. And I think that's one of the things too, when we really look at the six sense objects, is knowing that although there's similarity amongst in which we all experience, there's definitely very individual experiences. And just because we perceive or relate to things in a certain way doesn't mean somebody else does. And it doesn't mean that theirs is wrong. It doesn't mean yours is right either. And then when you step back further and say, even look at, you know, other animals, other insects, their whole way of perceiving and relating to the world can be completely different. What colors they see, if they even see, whether or not they essentially relate things through like chemosensory, a sense of smell. And you know, if you think of dogs, you know, they're sniffing all the time. It's basically, it is truly a form of communication for them. And so it's just a different means by which we can be informed, directed, and a certain guided through this world. They're useful. So I just want to take a little step back to our atonement ceremony yesterday. And there was the remarks that Shinge Roshi offered that reminded me of a quote in a film, Spotlight. So this came out in 2015. I won't delve really into the subject matter. It's really not the particular point. Needless to say, it revolves around particularly unfortunate, tragic, collective, karmic ways in which, horrendous activities can be conducted, and in which our willful ignorance, our sense of what, I don't know, essentially how we can justify or validate various things despite the information that's to the contrary. And it comes to a point where the character played by Liev Schreiber, basically these difficulties come forth. And so how could we not have acknowledged this before? And there's all that bickering, that blaming, all that ways in which, well, it's this, it's that. Like these people, like they're just hiding behind this. Lawyers, like they're just defending them. And all the ways in which we have these social frameworks that help us have some element of guidance and framework being abused and misused. And in things coming forth and being difficult, he says, sometimes it's easy to forget that we spend most of our time stumbling around the dark. Suddenly a light gets turned on and there's a fair share of blame to go around. I think it's really an important point. It's not the element of blaming, but the mere fact that we ourselves aren't free from it. We're just as much a part of it, even if it's unbeknownst to us. There's a way, of course, you know, we all have a limited world experience. There's a mere fact we can't know everything, we can't experience everything because we're just one person. We can't be everywhere at once. And yet, but there is a certain need for always questioning. It's not to undermine, but it really is an important thing that we're always questioning. There's all these things that are presented to us that, we're told them as though they're definitive, they're true. Not always. This is good. Of course, there are always those that they want to encourage and help you provide the ability to discover and experience for yourself. This is also an important thing. It's not a means of always people engage in one activity or another. We're dynamic, we're complex, and it's we're just human. So I've really found myself being called to the lines in Faith and Mind and looking at them in a little bit of a different light. One in all in one. If only this is realized, no more worry about your not being perfect. So in delving into this matter, I wanted to read a little excerpt from the Rohatsu Exhortations. So these are we're exhorted, Hakuin Akaku Zenji wants to inspire us as our students in this one-day session of Rohatsu. It happens always in commemoration of the Buddha's enlightenment, November 30th to December 8th. And hopefully this year, they'll be able to see it through its entirety. But of course, even if you can't be in person, you can always engage in this very determined, intensive, and joyous engagement of practice. So in the seventh night, Hakuin says, "It is said, if one person renounces home, 9 generations of his family will be born in heaven. The renouncer of home must be a true renouncer of home. To become a true renouncer of home means to uphold a great vow with a daring spirit, thus cutting through the root of life. Then Dharma nature reveals itself. This kind of person is called a true renouncer of home. That saying, 9 generations of his family will be born in heaven, is truth, not a lie." Earlier I touched on a little bit of this element of which particularly our familial connections can shape the ways we perceive and relate to the world. And of course there's an element simply by what we model, in which that naturally comes forth. And there's the ways in which it's simply shared, that we're really not that separate, we're not that different. Of course we have our own individual experiences, and yet there's a lot of interweaving and shared elements of that experience. So to flesh out a little bit of this, I want to bring our attention to another book, No Mud, No Lotus, The Art of Transforming Suffering by Thich Nhat Hanh. And this is in a section titled, The Pain of Our Ancestors. Some of our ill-being comes from hurt and pain in our own life, but some has been transmitted to us by our ancestors. Think of a stalk of corn that grows from a seed. Each ear of corn, each leaf contains that initial seed. In every cell of the plant, that seed is there. And just as the plant of corn is the continuation of the seed of corn, you are the continuation of your parents. Continues on. So if you have suffering in you and you don't know where it comes from, looking deeply, you may see that this is the suffering of your ancestors, handed down from one generation to another, because no one knew how to recognize, embrace, and heal it. It's not your fault, nor is it their fault. So part of looking deeply into our suffering is to know that it is not ours alone. When we're able to embrace our suffering, we're also able to embrace our ancestors. And the healing goes back through the generations. When we practice mindful breathing to know how to recognize, embrace, and transform our pain, we do it for them as well as for us. Then we can heal not only our own suffering and that of our ancestors, but we can also avoid transmitting this suffering to our loved ones, to our children and their children. Personally, I have the great fortune of, if we think of this, a family tree, at least from our parents, there's 2 branches. And as is suggested, they branch off into infinity. So, yes, I have that fortune. I have very loving parents. And as I've gotten older and looked at all those elements in which I blame my parents for this or that, of course there's the things that trigger me. Needless to say, there can be the one thing, if you really want to find out where you are in your practice, go to your family, particularly your parents, perhaps a sibling. One that can always keep you humble and honest, because if for nothing else, there's that reality of like, yeah, you haven't moved through that one, sorry. You can't really ever rid yourself of these things. Of course, there's a reality that by engaging with them, some of them are just completely diffused. They can't really, the seeds can't take root. Think of that process of weeding. You're not allowing them to spread. And then there are those that, at least from my own experience, seem to be those truly deeply seated things that we've come into this life with, whether they be our own personal karmic conditions or this karmic collective condition passed forth through the generations. And it is an interesting thing, because the challenge being at times, if you don't necessarily know what they are, but you certainly are conscious of them in a way in which they're very profoundly present, that notion of the elephant in the room. Of course, sometimes the elephant, you just feel a presence of it. You don't actually see it. You don't even know how to discuss it because you don't know its real origins. And that's the challenge of really oftentimes if we wanted to know the narrative of its origins. But there are many things in which we can never truly know, and there really isn't any particular source. That's where we have the Buddha provide these useful teachings, the source of suffering. It's real, it arises, and yet we can see it, encounter it, and heal it. So even if we don't know what it is, it doesn't mean we can't heal. At least for myself, one of the things I find challenging, in thinking of like children, I was talking about my friend's oldest son, that way in which you can tell they're just becoming more conscious of things. And there's these things that are unspoken. You can feel the presence of them, but they're not spoken about. And I think this is one of the great tragedies of like we see the wonderful potential of children. And of course, sometimes we need to be conscious of the fact that they really are at a stage of their maturation, of their development, in which they can really engage with particular things that, we want to protect them for a reason. They're still forming. You don't need to impose certain elements of trauma, a real trauma upon them that, why? Why would you impart that to them? You're trying to give them both the support and ideally the means of being able to deal with those difficulties of life. So why just immediately subject them? But the challenge being in this is sometimes even if you can't speak of the very things themselves, you can't ignore them either. I mean, we underestimate children and their ability to perceive. And then one of the great challenges, particularly as I was discussing early on in the talk, is that through each of our own conditioning, we deal with that in different ways. I think some almost, it's interesting, some, of course, they're provided guidance and support in the process, but they almost have an inherent ability to meet some of those things. There's just some people from a younger age, you can always say, nature, nurture, all that stuff, it's just kind of becomes a bunch of jargon really. But there's the reality of each of us is different. We come into this world with different conditions and we have different skill sets. And some, I think, just are more able to meet those things and be able to move through them. I mean, you can think of examples of people that they grew up in very difficult conditions. And yet, I'm sure through, in part, the support and guidance of people outside of their family, they're really remarkable people. Like, it's something that really helped fuel them, that they really took it to heart, that they didn't limit themselves to what was presented to them as the way, who they are, what their life should be. And that unfortunate, tragic element in which even in our familial context, that parents, elders, siblings can confine other family members to that. The sense of, oh, you think you're better than us. That way of just wrangling them in. And it's a very unfortunate thing. So of course not everybody does that in such a negative, aggressive way. There's also very positive things that can come about, the things that as a family we share that are wonderful. One of the things I think really was beneficial for me growing up was, my mom's side of the family, when she was 5 years old, they had built a cabin up in northern Minnesota. So for years I'd go up there. And one of the things personally I really, really loved was when there'd be like my grandparents there, my aunt and uncle, of course my parents, my sister and I, and we'd share, I just found it to be a wonderful time. You get up, you have breakfast, and after breakfast, you go to work. And then, of course, you come back together for lunch. And after lunch, there's, of course, a little time to just sort of sit and digest, but you go back to work. And then in the evening, sit down, relax, enjoy each other's company, maybe play some games or watch a movie. And I truly, truly enjoy that time. In many ways, as I'm just describing it now, it sounds very similar to the monastic life. There's those that have been here as residents, and even in many ways, you're here right now this week, you're a resident. You're here in this monastery doing training. You get up, you're exhausted. You go and you start to work, initially on the cushion. Initially hear this sound, this chanting. Something I personally love. I hope you've derived something from it as well. I mean, it's coming back to the element of the resonance of it. I mean, it's a wonderful body practice. I mean, it's not a traditional way of people think of body practices, but it's very much in the body and very much beyond this form. And then we go back to work. We meet for Dokusan. Go to the cushion. We have breakfast. And so on and so forth. And yeah, I'm truly grateful for that part of my life. And I'm very grateful to have found that with all of you. So I think really one of the big things I've been taking away from this whole process is that, as it was being identified here, by Hakuin and by Thich Nhat Hanh, is that it's really up to us. It's not that we can't support each other. It's not that we can't support our family members in it, but we have to take accountability and responsibility for ourselves. And it is a very freeing thing. And I can say I've had a great struggle with this. There is the reality in which in this process of encountering these things, of becoming very much more intimately familiar with the things we pass on throughout the generations. And just as a little aside, this isn't limited to our families. I mean, we are one family. Whether we look at the human condition as simply being a being on this world, in the cosmos, we are a family. And there's things that we perpetuate together, and both in positive and in negative. And they're not definitively those things. Of course, what we might perceive as a negative can, of course, be the seeds for something positive. But it's all a matter of changing our orientation and this accountability and responsibility to truly open up, as Shinge Roshi was talking about, if you look at the history of this monastery, to truly bring it to light. Is a most essential act. There's no real healing if we can't bring it into light. And one of the things I've found particularly helpful for me, it's been a nice shift really, is just the simple question of, what is this? And it's a question, of course, we hear with great frequency. But my relationship to it, I can't help but deny and still encounter that way in the what is this, there's that sense of you want to open up to it. You want to be rid of oftentimes things you're uncomfortable with. And so this sense of, what is this? Okay, let's usher you along now, be on your way. But I've been really finding that shift. And I think in many ways through this whole process of immersing myself in this investigation of perception, of aversion and craving, and really being able to be with my parents, with my family. And in some ways it's been very difficult, but in some ways it's been truly rewarding, because it's really forced me to look at all those things that I've been carrying forth. And I feel more of a space and opportunity now in this simple question of what is this? So I just want to close with a story that came to mind. I don't remember all the details of it. There'll be a little bit of a improvisational component to it, but I will convey the real essence of it to you. It really came forth for me today through when we were chanting our 5 reflections at the meal. And we come to our fifth reflection and just really having this feeling of these gifts. You know, we're not just talking about the food at the table, this gift, this life. And as is often the case in Zen stories, there's the old woman, the nameless old woman, vital to the story, very wise, very profound, and very direct. So there's this gentleman who's in this town, and he's having some difficulties. And he's talking to a friend of his and says, well, you should see this woman. I think she might be able to help you. So he goes to see her. And he's telling her, well, I'm having all these challenges, my kids, my wife at work. You know, what do you recommend? What can I do? She says, well, whenever you encounter something that you find difficult, just put your hands together inside. You don't have to do it for all to see, but this gasho, this reverential, and you say, thank you for everything. I have no complaints whatsoever. So he goes back to his home, goes back to work, and he tries to engage in this process. Okay, something arises, it's difficult, and thank you for everything. I have no complaints whatsoever. And as he goes throughout the week, he's finding, well, my kids are still difficult. My wife is angry with me. Like, my boss seems to think that I've screwed everything up. And so he counts all these things like, thank you for everything. I have no complaints whatsoever. Thank you for everything. I have no complaints whatsoever. And he goes back and he sees the old woman and he's telling her his account of the week. And he basically gets to the point of like finishing and looks at her and almost just say, his look just basically says, well, what do you have to say for yourself? Like, this is worthless. And she simply puts her hands together. Thank you for everything. I have no complaints whatsoever.